I guess let's jump right into it. The Ukraine war, there's a reality and there's a media narrative that I feel here in the UK and in the US we get a heavy dose of. Why are those so different, in your opinion? And what is really going on the ground in Ukraine versus what I just read at the Times in London or what I read in the New York Times on a regular basis?
Well, I think it's more than just a narrative now. I think the West, led primarily by Washington and London, has erected what I would call an empire of lies. It's truly devastating and it's shocking in its scale and impact. It's something that, frankly, I was completely unprepared for. I've never seen anything quite like this, where systematically we have lied about everything involving Russia and Ukraine now for months, if not years. And the truth of the matter is that people have never been told or not being told, and you can find the truth, but you've got to look for it, obviously, on the internet, is that Russia is by no means the evil aggressor in this thing. If anything, Russia launched an operation that it felt it had to secure its country. We have been working tirelessly for at least the last 20 years to undermine and weaken Russia in whatever way possible. We decided we didn't care much for Mr. Putin and his success at essentially retrieving Russia from the ash heap of history. And then the Russians made it very clear that they would not accept NATO on its borders. I mean, effectively, they'd done that with Latvia and Estonia. They do have a border up there, but they made it very clear that Ukraine, which is roughly the size of Texas and the United States, could never be a member of NATO, that simply presented too much of a danger. They made that clear in 2008 at Budapest. We ignored it. And then subsequently, Mr. Putin has given speeches reiterating the criticality of neutrality for Ukraine, unwilling to see NATO bases there. In 2014, one of the principal reasons that he intervened to seize Crimea was to prevent that naval base from falling into the hands of what he expected would be NATO forces. And remember, whenever he says NATO, he ultimately means the United States. It's the United States Navy that would have gone into the ports in Crimea. It's the United States Armed Forces that is moving eastward towards the Russian border. And we've chosen not to discuss that. In 2014, you also had this coup that we helped to organize and implement, which put people in power that otherwise would never have gotten there. And these people were violently anti-Russian, hostile to Russian national security interests. We encouraged that. We cultivated it. We began pouring money into this thing called the Ukrainian army. Really, it's more the army than anything else. And in 2014, this fledgling Ukrainian army began immediately attacking the Russians in eastern Ukraine, in the so-called provinces or oblasts of Donetsk and Luhansk. And in the time between the first attacks by artillery in 2014 and the intervention by the Russians in February of 2022, they killed 14,000 people. And they fired thousands and thousands of rounds of artillery. In fact, in the week or two just before the Russians finally moved in, they fired over 2,000 rounds of artillery ammunition. And these were all being fired at Russian civilians. Now, notice I say Russian civilians. They were technically Ukrainian citizens. They just happened to be Russians. And of course, these Russians were being oppressed. They were effectively presented with a fait accompli. Either you become Ukrainian, you stop speaking Russian, you speak Ukrainian, you write in Ukrainian, and you adopt Ukrainian identity and culture and so forth, or we're going to punish you. And so the Russians in eastern Ukraine have been second or third class citizens now for years. All of this did not go down well in Russia, as you can imagine. And then, of course, we had this thing called the Minsk Accords, which was in theory presented to the Russians as a way to get past the conflict and maintain some measure of civility and peace in Ukraine. Well, it didn't work, and it didn't work, as we've discovered, because first Chancellor Merkel, who's now retired, and then subsequently Mr. Macron, the president of France, both admitted the whole thing was a hoax. It was simply a device to buy time for the Ukrainians to build their forces up. And it became very clear to the Russians that this large force, which was extremely well equipped and I would argue reasonably well trained, certainly by NATO standards, was poised to launch an attack at Russia with the goal of crushing the Russians in Luhansk and Donetsk and then ultimately retaking Crimea. So the Russians said, no, thank you. And they intervened. The big mistake they made is that they assumed that someone was willing to negotiate with them. And so they went in with a really small force, no more than 90,000 on the ground in terms of combat troops. And they discovered after 2 or 3 months, 4 months, even though they were not taking heavy casualties as originally reported, they took very light casualties. It was the Ukrainians that had begun taking heavy casualties almost from the beginning. They discovered that they weren't going to get a negotiated settlement. Finally, the generals met with Putin last summer and said, this is a war. This is not what we bargained for. We miscalculated. The underlying assumptions were wrong. There is no one to talk to. And you'll recall that shortly after your former prime minister's visit in April to Mr. Zelensky, that any hope of talks was crushed.